one of the really common ways that attacks are launched is by coming from corporate PCs. And so the way this works, I've got an article headline here from Fierce Telecom pointing out the telecom networks are under far greater malware pressure than the global norm. So this was a study done about a year and a half ago that found that the telecom providers, including cellular phone companies, internet service providers, they seemed to get a lot more malware attempts than a lot of other companies did. Now, it's possible that has something to do with their ability to detect it, but they detect the malware attempts. But there were a lot of attempts to basically send email to the accounting department or the marketing department and actually get people in those departments to click on those links, download malware, install malware on their Windows machines, and then those machines inside the telecom network would actually be controlled or be able to launch further attacks. So most attacks are launched first against corporate PCs, and then what they can do, if your network allows it, is they can make outbound connections to core servers. And so, for example, you might see something like this, where we've got PCs here in a separate network, and then you've got your servers, server 1. The malware comes in from the internet via email. It goes to those and machines, those PCs, and then if in the worst case, it's actually distributed out to the servers, or these machines themselves are able to launch attacks against the servers. So this is an undesirable scenario, of course, because the attackers weren't able to send traffic directly to the servers. Maybe we had firewalls and other kinds of effective security there, but they were able to launch attacks against these PCs. A related version of this is breakout, where the attacker actually gets a toehold in the network by launching the attack against the Windows machine here, but the Windows machine is not really the ultimate target. What they really want to do is launch an attack against the servers and get access to that. So one of the key defenses against that, so that's the big broad threat. The more narrow mechanism that we use to defend against this would be a firewall of some form. And so what we would have is some kind of isolation where these machines, if necessary, maybe are only able to connect to certain very narrow services on these servers. Maybe these are the publicly facing servers. But it's also possible that, if you're in the accounting department or you're in the marketing department or many other organizations in your company, you actually don't have any need at all to directly connect to your operational servers and routers and switches and other kind of infrastructure that's necessary to run the company. In fact, it may be totally okay if you connect out to the internet. So you connect to a VPN, for example, to get access, or maybe you just never really log into these networks. That would be a totally normal state of affairs for a lot of organizations. But we can be sloppy and accidentally say, well, because I've got, for example, an engineer over here on the same corporate network, that engineer does need to be able to log into these servers because that's what that engineer does every day. And so we get sloppy and we allow the other machines to connect in through those same servers. And there's actually some real big measurable differences between user training and experience and awareness of security issues, malware, for example, and the risk that is posed by that user. So if this is a marketing department machine and that marketing department person doesn't have the same awareness of the safety of downloading attachments, opening and running Windows attachments on their Windows PC, then they're going to put the network at greater risk than an engineer who does have that kind of awareness and training. And so you do want to have some sort of firewall isolation between your PCs and your core security enclave servers. So the servers that need to be protected, you want to have isolation there. You don't just want firewall policies that allow all traffic in an unlimited kind of way. we've touched on this a little bit already, but we're going to mention it again. One of you had an interesting comment and referred me to an interesting book that was covered on this. So if you discover an infected server, you want to destroy and create a replacement. So destroying and creating it is actually relatively easy in a virtualized environment. You can just delete the entire virtual machine and start over. But if you remove you call yourself removing the malware from the system, you're in general not going to be able to overcome persistence mechanisms, and that's what these are called, persisting. Persistence is the set of technologies that allow the software to stay running on the system. You know, if you think about my example of running yum update and you're putting new operating system files on there on purpose, but you may not realize how much of the old operating system you're leaving behind. That may give you a clue for what would happen if somebody was intentionally trying to hide software on your system. It's really not that hard. Systems are really large and really complex. Malware can be hidden in the OS kernel, can be hidden in drivers. It can even be hidden in the operating system update tool. So yum itself could be affected. And other hardware, for example, BIOS, network cards, video cards, they can be compromised to reinfect later. So this kind of firmware launched infection is rare, but it's possible. But there's a fairly easy defense, which is to say you don't try to reuse those old things. So if you had to reuse old physical hardware, you could update the firmware on those cards, like network cards, video cards, if you want to defend against that risk. But if you're using virtualized servers, it's expected that would provide some advantage because the operating system doesn't have access to the firmware. So, for example, if your video card on the server is in a hypervisor host, so like a VMware ESXi host, then your malware is not going to have direct access to the video card. It's actually going to talk to an emulated video device, which, if so attached, could connect to the actual video card, but usually doesn't in ESXi. And so the virtualized server can provide you some isolation from the hardware. But what that's basically saying is we are able to delete the old virtual machine 100% and create a new virtual machine with a new operating system installation from a trusted source in order to ensure that we've gotten rid of that software. You really can't clean up old malware and know that you've got it deleted. And so I'll just give this as an example of how a narrow technology solution, which is to say delete the old machine, reinstall the operating system, is really a fairly easy, though it's a broad brush approach, but it's a fairly easy approach to defend against a variety of attacks. So if you hear about, like, there's a new attack and they're able to hide their malware in the network interface card on the Intel, Intel chipsets for Ethernet cards, well, that's a pretty cool type of attack. That's pretty interesting that people figure that out. But if you know that, well, I already have a defense against that, I know how to handle that, then it can make these problems a lot more tractable. So it's kind of cool to talk about broad threats on one hand. It's important, though, to identify specific technical measures that you can take on the other hand that are going to give you substantial defense. So back to the corporate PCs, using firewalls to defend against corporate PCs, we want to assume that our PCs and Macs and Android machines and others are going to launch attacks against our server. So we treat the corporate PCs as untrusted devices. So we block them in the firewalls when possible. And what we want to do is we want to limit access to the minimum required protocols, or maybe even use a VPN that only gives them access to authorized protocols from authorized clients. So they don't need to be logging in on every potential browser. Maybe they need to be using the browser with the corporate signed TLS certificate in it. And so there are things we do to allow, for example, narrow access. So SSH can only talk to server 1, HTTPS talk to server 2, etc. Those things can help eliminate our problems as long as we have a default deny at the bottom where we block everything else. Everything that we don't need to have access to, we can block it. Now, if you've got your firewall set up to allow SSH access to corporate server from the corporate network to server number 1, and there is some sort of open SSH vulnerability, then of course this firewall is not doing you any good because you've allowed the traffic to come through to that update, to that server. So you still have to run on server 1, you still have to run your operating system updates to defend against the vulnerabilities in the OpenSSH software, for example. And there are a lot of vulnerabilities in OpenSSH. It's a big and complex package. But you have at least narrowed it down so that maybe the NTP on server 1 has been hidden from the rest of the network. So you do have improvements, but you've got to put these things together, not only limiting with a firewall, but also doing the operating system updates.